Let's begin our session with Ukraine war negotiations. Russia will withdraw from negotiations if Ukraine fails to cede Donbas to Russia, according to Bloomberg. Is this a make or break moment for Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I just think, Daniel, that this report, which came out in Bloomberg, probably from Russian officials, is just the Kremlin thumping its chest and saying, you have to surrender to us. You and I have discussed for weeks now that even if you have talks between Ukraine and Russia and the United States, that the Kremlin is not giving up its maximum demands on Ukraine. And even though there was a report over the weekend that Russia may now accept security guarantees for Ukraine, this was said by President Zelensky's chief of staff, Mr. Budanov. Even if Russia is willing to concede on the security guarantees, they're not willing to concede on seizing all of Donetsk. And I think also I've mentioned that the Kremlin can't afford to give up that demand because this is Vladimir Putin's legacy. If he can't give all of Ukraine over to Russians as part of a greater Russia, he at least wants to have the Donbas. The question here is okay, how do people respond to that Russian threat to pull out of the talks? I think for Ukraine, it's a fairly simple response. It is, no, you're not going to get the Donbas. No, we can't give up territory. Constitutionally, we can't give up territory without a referendum. But we're also not going to give up what is strategically important territory, and we're not going to concede on our sovereignty. So if Ukraine's not going to concede on that, the question is, well, what position will the Trump administration take? Will the Trump administration say, oh gosh, yeah, Russia should really have all of the Donbass. It's really not fair. And so we have an end to the talks, and we have the Trump people again lining up with the Kremlin, which they have done from time to time over the past more than 13 months? Or will the Trump camp say, no, it's realistic for Ukraine to call for a ceasefire on the basis of the front lines? We're going to stand alongside Kyiv and say to the Russians that this is where this has to wind up, and you have to pull back on your demand for all of Donbass. Is that the line they take? So I think the American reaction is going to be very, very important here. I think we know that Ukraine was not in these talks in the expectation that the Kremlin would compromise. I think we know that Ukraine's in these talks and that Europe is supporting Ukraine in these talks because this is a way of putting pressure on the Russians. That if the Russians are not going to compromise, then finally the Americans will realize they have to come in alongside Europe in terms of defending Ukraine, and that this could be a defense for some time. Something that the Trump camp has walked away from. Those are the tactics that are in play, and I don't think this Russian statement really changes much.
Also, according to Bloomberg, Russia is ready to withdraw troops from Ukrainian northeastern Sumy and Kharkiv regions, as well as from Dnipropetrovsk region as part of the possible deal, and wouldn't press demands for more territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Could we face any kind of wider opening for better compromise here?
Again, I would like to give you grounds for optimism, but this is not a change in the Russian position. I can remember before last year, as Vladimir Putin met Donald Trump in Alaska, this was the line the Russians took, which is, you give us Donetsk, you give us all of the Donbass, and then we'll give back small amounts of territory that we've tried to seize, and indeed had seized up in Sumy and in Kharkiv in the northeast. And we won't push for any further territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia. And it's like, well, no, that's not the way this works, folks. Just because Russia, and they put in a lot of effort in 2025 to seize that strip along the Ukraine border in the northeast so they could have a bargaining chip. Just because you have this bargaining chip doesn't mean you get to cash it in. and that we give up all of Donetsk. And similarly, just because you say, oh, well, we're not going to demand all of Zaporizhia, we're not going to demand all of Kherson, including areas that Russia lost in the Ukraine counteroffensive in 2022. Just because you say you're not going to want to seize more territory in the south doesn't mean that you get to seize territory in the east. So, again, I know why Bloomberg's reporting it. And I mean, I know why the Russian officials are saying it, but I hope analysts out here will simply call this out. This isn't a serious compromise that's being put by the Russians. These are tactics, simply tactics. And again, the main audience for those tactics are probably going to be Donald Trump's envoys and his officials.
You just mentioned about Alaska summit. Also, according to this Bloomberg reporting, Putin, a day before the Alaska summit, organized a meeting with his top officials in the Kremlin. And, quote, it was the same room where he had staged a TV meeting with officials days before the invasion began. And Putin asked officials whether they would support U.S. offer to end the war in Ukraine. And, quote, initially silent officials rose one by one to speak, and the majority supported the proposal, arguing that the war should end. Could this mean that there is more appetite inside the Kremlin to end this war among Putin's inner circle?
Yeah, but what exactly was the American proposal to end the war last August? I mean, as far as we know, going into August, the Kremlin had been working hard at manipulating Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy, the real estate developer, into accepting demands such as the ones that I've set out. And that is, again, primarily that Donetsk, we get the rest of Donetsk, and the rest of Ukraine is kept relatively weak. No entry into NATO, no significant Western military aid, no foreign troops inside Ukraine to give it support. Well, if that's the American proposal that was on the table in Alaska, yeah, of course the Russians are going to accept it. It gives them primarily what they want. Now, if the Americans' proposal was something different, if the American proposal was a ceasefire on the front lines and then we'll discuss these issues, it would be something if Russian officials supported a ceasefire on the current front lines, because I've seen no sign that the Kremlin has favored that or is going to accept it. So I need more here. I really need more. And I've got respect for Bloomberg as a reporting organization, but folks, what you need to critically evaluate what the Russian officials are feeding you. You really do. And I think if there's a wider significance to these stories coming out, the Russians are working really, really hard to shift the narrative in case we do get another set of trilateral talks, or to shift the narrative to justify why they are not going to go into trilateral talks, and to say, look, we're the ones who are supposedly being reasonable here. Why doesn't Kyiv give us what we want?
Let's also cover this optimistic statements, surprise statements from General Budanov, head of the President Zelensky office. He said, quote, Putin has agreed to accept U.S. security guarantees. Budanov added that Russian army is not preparing to advance on Kyiv anytime soon. He also expressed confidence in the prospects of a peace talks. I have also personally watched this big interview he has done with probably largest Ukrainian media during this weekend, during the last days. It was surprise statements from his side. How do you read this?
Yeah, I mean, again, in terms of substance, I need more here. I mean, we've critiqued the Kremlin. Now we need to critique the Zelensky government, and that is, okay, if Kirill Budanov is saying, well, they're going to agree to security guarantees. Which security guarantees are they agreeing to? Are they agreeing to all of the proposals for the security guarantees? That includes European troops inside Ukraine as part of ensuring that the ceasefire holds. Well, the Kremlin has never agreed to that. And in fact, they've always said they will attack if European troops are inside Ukraine. Are the are the Russians agreeing to Ukraine getting significant military aid from the West to maintain its defenses against any future invasion? Are the Russians agreeing to U.S. involvement in the security guarantees overseeing air power? Or are the Russians merely agreeing to, and we already knew this, they're merely agreeing to monitoring arrangements of the ceasefire, which could be considered security guarantees? And we know that last week, that's what President Zelensky was focused on, that while the political track of the talks was not going well, the military track was making an advance on the monitoring arrangements for the ceasefire. So if I don't have details there, I'm like, okay, it's limited in terms of what I can say in terms of the significance. But then I've got a wider question, which is, why does Mr. Budanov say this now? What is, and my immediate reading of that, and I'm happy, be interested if viewers come in and give me their perspective on it, and if you gave me your perspective on it. But my reading of it is that this is Ukraine trying to bounce Russia, or maybe more accurately, put Russia in a corner, which says, look, you've agreed to security guarantees. So if the Russians then come back and say, either as part of their propaganda or say in the talks, no, we don't agree to the security guarantees. We've never agreed to this. This makes them look like the bad guys, right? So, you sort of set this out that Russia has made a compromise just for the possibility, or maybe even the expectation, that when the Kremlin does not compromise, again, the Americans back you. The Americans don't just simply say, oh, okay, the Kremlin has rejected this and we're going to accept Russia's line.
That's really interesting possible mind games and negotiation tactics between both sides. And also, despite the big war in Iran, in the Middle East, Russia and Ukraine still expect planned US-led peace talks to happen probably in Istanbul, according to Bloomberg. What are your expectations? Because many analysts and media reporting say that this could be like make or break moment. Last meetings before we have any kind of outcome.
I would be really surprised if we get that type of meeting, especially a significant meeting. Look, what's happened in the last, I'm speaking to you on a Monday, so what's happened since Saturday with the Israel-US war, and it is a war on Iran, that completely changes the dynamics. I mean, just think of the comparison. If I'm talking to you, when I'm talking to you last week, I talked to you and Sophia on Thursday, we were in the midst of Donald Trump's envoys. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in Geneva. Now they were talking to Ukrainian officials, including Rustem Umerov, the lead Ukrainian negotiator, about the possibility of more talks. But Witkoff and Kushner were also there talking in indirect talks with Iran. So they were trying to do two things at once. Well, what's happened since then on the Saturday is the Trump camp have decided to go with this war on Iran to try to break the regime or force it to accept American demands. And when you're in the midst of waging that war, because the regime is not surrendering, we know that from its retaliation today. If the regime's not surrendering, you've got to devote a lot of your military and your political effort to handling that war. You can't then go off and say, oh, here we are, now we're going to go over and mediate these talks between Ukraine and Russia. Again, especially if you think those talks are on the verge of a breakthrough. So now I think this is spin. I think this is spin that, oh, yeah, we can all get together, we can all meet. The war in Iran doesn't affect us. No, the war in Iran does affect us. It affects so many things we could talk about. It affects the price of oil. It's dramatically affect European gas prices today. It is affecting the U.S. military posture. So therefore, it is going to affect where the Americans, what they're capable of doing and what they're willing to do in terms of trying to get a Ukraine-Russia settlement.
Hi, I'm Scott Lucas. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, subscribe, spread the word, send ideas.